Welcome. The American bison, its numbers in the wild, were estimated at around 30 million individuals. But when the Europeans colonized the Americas, they kept driving them away everywhere and committed the largest animal extermination operation in all of history, until in 1884 their numbers in the wild reached a mere 300 individuals. In a famous photograph taken in the late 19th century, people are standing on a huge pyramid-like pile made entirely of bison skulls. So, what's the story? And why did the American Army wipe out the bison like that? Welcome, I'm Mind Matrix Files. But before we begin, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you get our videos first. The bison is a massive type of cattle that was incredibly widespread in the prairies and grasslands stretching from Alaska in North America to the Gulf of Mexico in the far south. It was considered the largest mammal in the entire continent of North America. The indigenous people of the Americas relied on it fundamentally for many things. You could say it was like a treasure to them. Firstly, they ate its meat, and they used its summer hide to make tents. As for the winter hide, they made blankets and winter clothing from it. Even the bones and horns were used to make tools. The bison is an animal that reproduced in huge numbers. Its population in the wild ranged from 30 million to 60 million individuals. However, despite this, the indigenous people did not hunt them in large quantities. They only hunted what they needed and treated them as an important part of their culture. Up until this point, the situation was good, and there were no problems. But problems began to appear with the arrival of the Europeans, as usual, in the 1850s. The Europeans had tightened their grip on the Americas and settled there. The United States had declared its independence decades earlier, but despite this, the indigenous people were still present, and a large group of them lived in the central and western parts of America, specifically in the interior Plains region. That's why they were called the Plains Indians. By the way, the word Indians is just European arrogance. These people are called the indigenous people. It's just that when the Europeans supposedly discovered the Americas, they thought they had reached India, so they called them Indians. They didn't know it was a new land at the time. Anyway, these Plains Indians were a headache for the Europeans because the Europeans wanted to gather all the indigenous people in this area and confine them to a small village to live in. After that, the Europeans would plunder and steal the lands, just as they had stolen those before. They had something at the time called the dream of American expansion westward, and that it was their destiny to colonize these lands. The same old worn-out record we all know. But every time they tried to encroach on the plains areas, the indigenous people would prevent them, fight them, and inflict heavy losses, especially since the terrain of these areas was complex, and the Plains Indians knew it like the back of their hand. They were an armed group and skilled horse riders. The Americans at the time had just emerged from a civil war, so they couldn't handle any more battles. That's why they came up with a very cunning idea to achieve their goals. The commander of the American Army at the time, William Sherman, told them, "Don't these Plains Indians rely on the bison for almost everything?" They said, "Yes." He said, "Simple. We have nothing to do with the Indians. We will eliminate the bison themselves, and thus we will starve them and force them to ask us for help." Especially since the indigenous people at the time had no contact with the outside world, unlike the Americans, who were importing everything they needed from Europe. Indeed, the American Army gave the green light to thousands of European hunters to decimate the bison. Despite the fact that there were treaties between the American Army and the tribal leaders prohibiting hunters from entering their lands, the Americans, as usual, did not abide by the agreements. In fact, they protected the hunters and provided them with weapons and ammunition to hunt with. This is in addition to the American cavalry, which also got involved and began to exterminate the bison themselves. When the indigenous people protested, and human rights organizations intervened, a superficial resolution was passed in the American Congress in 1874 stipulating that bison hunting was illegal. However, the American president at the time, Ulysses S. Grant, objected to the resolution and repealed it, saying, "Whoever wants to hunt, let them hunt." In fact, the Americans at the time began to promote the idea of recreational hunting and started telling Europeans, if anyone wants to come and hunt bison for fun, they are welcome. They even began sending invitations to athletes and celebrities in Europe to come and hunt bison in America, as if it were a celebration. Thousands of bison were killed daily, to the extent that in 1876, one European hunter alone killed 5,800 bison in just 2 months, which is approximately 100 bison every day. The matter didn't stop there. The Americans noticed that there was a high demand for hides in Europe, so they promoted the idea of profiting from bison hides. This, in turn, increased poaching operations. One of the most heinous practices they carried out was that hunters would shoot the bison, then take the hide and leave the meat on the ground to rot so that no one would benefit from it. In fact, some of them would put poison in the meat so that no one would eat it, and if a wolf came to eat it, it would die too, and they would take the wolf's fur and leave its carcass as well. Of course, if any of the indigenous people found the meat and wanted to eat it, they would face the same fate. After the meat decomposed, the hunters would collect the bones and skulls that remained, either to boast or to grind them up and use them as fertilizer. This is when the famous photograph we talked about at the beginning of the episode was taken. The Plains Indians, meanwhile, were watching the Americans decimate their primary animal. Initially, they didn't understand why they were doing this, and they also didn't understand why the Europeans no longer attacked them as before. But with time, of course, the picture became clear. Unfortunately, the indigenous people discovered this too late, and the bison numbers had decreased significantly, and they couldn't find anything to eat. In the late 1880s, the number of bison in the wild ranged from 300 to 500 individuals. In fact, some statistics say they reached a total of 100 individuals. Thus, their despicable strategy succeeded, and they triumphed over the Plains Indians. After the Plains Indians were deprived of their food resources, they were forced to submit to the Americans due to starvation. They left their lands and went to live in areas they were not allowed to leave. In return, the people who occupied the land would provide them with food. European companies then entered the lands, seized them and their resources, and created tourist and recreational parks in the places where the Plains Indians used to live. One of the ironically absurd things is that after the Americans eliminated the Plains Indians and confined their residents, they started saying, "Oh dear, the bison population has decreased so much. This is unacceptable, folks. Animals have rights too." And they played the role of the morality police as usual and began to ban hunting and arrest anyone who hunted the animal illegally. They made the same film they make after every disaster. In the end, they turned the bison from an animal that reproduced in huge numbers into an animal threatened with extinction. But fortunately, some wealthy Americans at the time had kept some bison in their private farms. The American government then took them along with the few that remained in the wild and put them in large reserves and began to care for them for many years until their numbers increased again. Currently, their numbers have reached about 500,000 individuals, which is nothing compared to the original numbers. However, they were ultimately saved from extinction. Afterwards, they released groups of them into the plains to reintegrate with wildlife again, and the bison problem was somewhat resolved. As for the problem of the indigenous people, there is no news about it. That's it, we're done. Whoever made it this far, you are the best people. Please give us a like before you leave so we know how many people reach the end. And don't forget, if you have a suggestion for an episode, write it to us in the comments. Goodbye.